In this episode, we're keeping our focus on the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, Texas. In our effort to collectively understand why an 18-year-old gunman would shoot and kill 21 people, 19 of them children, in a fourth grade classroom, two words have been forced into this conversation: mental illness. It's a well-worn excuse that's brought up when trying to understand what drives gunmen to commit mass murder. That's also what happened after the racist attack at the Top supermarket in Buffalo, New York earlier this month. Now, we're not saying that mental health was not a factor in those shootings, but health professionals caution conflating mental health and violence for fear that it could further stigmatize mental illnesses. Newsy national correspondent Amber Strong has more.
The mental state of the mass shooter at a Texas elementary school has gotten a lot of attention from some Republican politicians.
They said, we have a problem with mental health illness in this community.
We know what does prevent crime, which is going after felons and fugitives and those with serious mental illness, arresting them, prosecuting them when they try to illegally buy firearms.
The attention on mental illness could be both good or bad, according to doctors. On one hand, mental health programs are often lacking funding, but doctors say the way the narrative is being presented could lead to stigma.
The majority of people with mental illness do not engage in violence and are oftentimes not the ones that are engaging in mass shootings.
People with mental illness are more likely to be the victims than the perpetrators.
According to the Department of Health and Human Services, most people with mental illness aren't violent. Only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to people with serious mental illness. And according to the American Psychological Association, when you do see violent behavior in people with mental illness, there are contributing factors like substance or child abuse.
About 42% of shooters have had some trauma history themselves and may have experienced things like bullying or some type of physical or sexual abuse during their childhood. So there is some connection between mental health, but mental illness is not the driving force.
Mental health experts say when society conflates violence and mental illness, people who need help may not seek it.
If you say that, it's really stigmatizing, and people have not come into my office for treatment because of that. People have thought, well, my family or my friends will think I'm violent, or what if I have that diagnosis and it means I'm violent? And that scares people from getting help.
That's not to say there isn't a cause to examine treatment or the lack thereof. According to a study from Stanford University School of Medicine, upon examining 35 mass shooters who survived, 28 had untreated and unmedicated psychiatric disorders. One thing doctors seem to agree on is that the solution can only come when the nation addresses the myriad of factors that lead to violence.
When something bad happens, we want a reason for it, right? We want to say, the reason that this person did this is because of mental illness. Sometimes the explanation is just people are bad people, people have hate, people have access to weapons.
Amber Strong, Newsy.
All right, many thanks for that reporting, Amber. There are still a lot of questions surrounding how the shooter carried out his attack, and some experts estimate that it'll take months to fully understand the scope of this massacre. Here's some of what we do know. An 18-year-old gunman killed 21 people, including 19 children, after entering Robb Elementary School and firing on a fourth grade classroom. He used an AR-15 style rifle, one of two he legally purchased after his 18th birthday. During the attack, children and teachers from inside the school repeatedly called 911 to send help. 90 minutes after the attack began, the gunman was dead after exchanging gunfire with Border Patrol agents. Some of the biggest questions now are about the law enforcement response. Community members in Uvalde have criticized local law enforcement for inconsistent reporting on the timeline of the attack. The story has evolved almost every day since the attack, and for not acting sooner. Here's what the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety had to say Friday about the decision by law enforcement to not breach the classroom.
For the benefit of hindsight, where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision, period. There's no excuse for that.
Meanwhile, people in Uvalde have coalesced around those grieving their tragic losses by offering up resources to help them cope. Newsy's Axel Tercios is on the ground there and has been speaking to members of that community. Axel, what have you learned about how folks in Uvalde have helped each other in the wake of this attack?
Christian, it's incredible that even in times of darkness and sadness, this community here in Uvalde and the communities around have come together in this time of need to help and offer support to those families and just anyone here that has been affected by this tragedy. Funeral homes in the community have offered to help the victims' families by offering their funeral services at no costs. Governor Abbott also announced that an anonymous donor will pick up any costs. The Texas Department of Public Safety has set up a family assistance center to address immediate needs and to provide information, support, and resources to those directly affected. Also, help is coming from all over the nation and the world, with several fundraisers to help those who have been affected by this tragedy. Donations for the teacher who was killed during the school shooting in Texas this week and her husband, who died 2 days later, have raised more than $2 million on a GoFundMe page that was opened. The couple leaves behind 4 children. Also, GoFundMe has set up a central page for anyone who wishes to help the families. One of the pools has raised almost $4 million. Throughout the day here at this square in downtown Uvalde, we have seen hundreds of people, local groups coming and offering emotional support to the families, friends, and just anyone who has been affected by this tragedy. We've also seen people coming by, holding hands, hugging, doing prayers, and bringing in toys, teddy bears, candles, and flowers at these 21 crosses that have been set up here at this square in downtown Uvalde that represent each and one of the 21 victims that died here in Uvalde. Christian.
All right, many thanks, Axel. Now, there's a noteworthy event happening in Houston, Texas, Friday, less than 300 miles east of Uvalde. The National Rifle Association's annual convention. The convention, which had its largest turnout ever in 2018, was canceled in 2020 and 2021 due to the pandemic. Now, the annual meeting of NRA members has been in the works for months at least, and the NRA has been in this position before, hosting a convention that celebrates the Second Amendment after a mass shooting. Back in 1999, roughly a week after the Columbine High School shooting, the organization went ahead with a shortened version of its meeting. Then NRA President Charlton Heston said that the horrible acts shouldn't become opportunities to limit constitutional rights.
When an isolated, terrible event occurs, our phones ring, demanding that the NRA explain the inexplicable. Why us? Because their story needs a villain. They want us to play the heavy in their drama of packaged grief.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott was originally scheduled to speak in person, but changed his appearance to a pre-recorded message. At least 3 musical performers have also backed out at the last minute. Still, former President Donald Trump, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, and South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem were still scheduled to make in-person appearances. There's been no shortage of reactions to the tragedy that took place this week, from thoughts and prayers.
I wish to extend my condolences and those of the entire department to the people of Uvalde.
To sadness and frustration.
I don't want her just to be another face. I don't want any of those kids to be just another face. Each one of them has a story to tell.
And even optimism.
So let's find empowerment through actions. Let's learn together and let's fight together, because we can and we will demand action for change.
But how is the rest of the world viewing the latest mass shooting in the US? We called up some of our colleagues abroad to break down what's being said where they are. Let's start by getting a look at what we have heard from our neighbors in South and Central America. Mari Trini Mena has their reactions from Caracas, Venezuela.
The Uvalde shooting in Texas has deeply impacted Latin America. Many leaders throughout the region have expressed their condolences to the families of the victims, especially Mexico, which was one of the first countries to comment on the tragedy. We need to remember that the shooting took place in a Latino community, and the majority of the children who died had close ties to Mexico. Uvalde is only around 70 miles from the US-Mexico border. Even though school shootings are not common in Latin America, there is a different reality here. Crimes involving guns are frequent, and much of the region struggles with gun-related violence. The high numbers of homicides in Latin American countries such as Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico and El Salvador are mostly caused by civilians taking part in armed gangs. Extortion, drug trafficking, and disappearances are everyday practices involving guns. The rising violence has forced many Latin American families to migrate, escaping not only from poverty or unemployment, but also from the killings.
All right, many thanks, Mari. Across the globe, other countries took much swifter actions after a major mass shooting. Our London correspondent, Giles Gibson, shows us how the UK reacted to this one and what memories it drudged up for a former athlete.
As we've seen with previous national tragedies on either side of the Atlantic, political leaders sent messages of support in the wake of the mass shooting in Uvalde. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the country's thoughts are with all those affected by this horrific attack. Meanwhile, echoing that impassioned speech that we saw from Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, sports stars here in the UK have also been weighing in on this, including the tennis player Andy Murray, who described what happened in Texas as, quote, madness. This is certainly a very personal issue for him because he was actually a student at Dunblane Primary School in Scotland in 1996 when a gunman attacked the school, killing 16 children and one of their teachers. That massacre led to the UK Parliament actually passing much stricter gun control legislation, and we've actually seen only a handful of mass shootings in this country ever since then. I'm Giles Gibson for Newsy in London.
All right, many thanks, Giles. As we highlighted earlier this week, the mindset of owning guns in Japan is very different compared to how many Americans feel about gun ownership. Our correspondent Phoebe Amoroso explains from Tokyo that that difference in mindset is the source of criticism from people living on the island nation.
Here, there has been an outpouring of sympathy for the victims of the shooting, and there's also been criticism of the US's gun culture. In an editorial, the Asahi Shimbun newspaper called on the US to rethink its democracy before preaching its democracy to the rest of the world. Gun violence in Japan is incredibly rare. The country only logged 1 death in 2021. That's as guns are incredibly strictly regulated. Prospective owners must undergo training, psychiatric assessment, and pass a written test. Police will even interview their neighbors to get a sense of what kind of person they are. A gun and ammunition must then be kept under separate lock and key, and an owner must present a log every year of every bullet fired. Phoebe Amoroso, Newsy, Tokyo.